The book Fire and Rain is a narrative, according to author Carolyn Woods Eisenberg, about the way national security decisions formed at the highest levels of government affect the lives of individuals at home and abroad. Her primary focus is on the way the Nixon administration fought and ended the Vietnam War. Early in the book, Hofstra University professor Eisenberg quotes President Nixon's predecessor, LBJ, during his 1964 election campaign. Quote, "We are not about to send American boys 9 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves. However, the U.S. left Vietnam permanently in 1975, and at the end, the number of U.S. military personnel killed in the war was 58,098 Americans."
Hi, I'm Tammy, and joining me today is Paul as we celebrate 45 years of C-SPAN's unblinking eye on the democratic process.
That's right, Tammy. Since our founding in 1979, C-SPAN has been documenting history with a unique approach, unfiltered, without commentary, and entirely independent from government funding. C-SPAN is funded by fees from our cable and satellite distribution partners, and now with fewer people subscribing to cable and satellite, we're asking you to help support our next 45 years.
It's amazing to see how C-SPAN has adapted and grown. With the rise of digital platforms and social media, C-SPAN has expanded its reach, so no matter where you are, you have 24/7, 365 access to the democratic process.
And as we navigate this ever-changing media environment, C-SPAN's dedication to putting you in the rooms where politics is debated and policy is determined will not waver.
We ask you to support C-SPAN's vital mission. As we celebrate 45 years of service, your contribution helps us to continue to adapt and grow in this digital age. Visit cspan.org/donate to make your contribution today.
Here's to 45 more years of bringing democracy directly to you wherever you get your news. Thank you for your support. Visit cspan.org/donate today to make a difference.
Professor Eisenberg, before we talk about your book, I want you to hear this from General Westmoreland back in April 28 of 1967.
Given the nature of the enemy, it seems to me that the strategy we are following at this time is the proper one, and that it is producing results. While he obviously is far from quitting, there are signs that his morale and his military structure are beginning to deteriorate. The rate of decline will be in proportion to the pressure directed against him. Your servicemen in Vietnam are intelligent, skilled, dedicated, and courageous. They believe in what they're doing. Backed at home by resolve, confidence, patience, determination, and continued support, we will prevail in Vietnam over the communist aggressor.
That was in front of Congress, and he was in charge of the military in Vietnam. What are you hearing there?
I'm hearing how out of reality he was. It's very interesting. I actually was at an event with General Westmoreland after the war, and he was making the point then. So he never changed in a way that he was making the point that really we had won the war. And that the only thing that happened was that the Soviet Union had sent disinformation agents. It was never clear if he meant me, but they were sending disinformation agents into the United States and were turning people against the war, so that people didn't realize how well things were going. This is years later. So I think he never, really was the view. He was they were sabotaged, on the home front, and otherwise everything would have been, excellent. But, part of the story of Vietnam is, as you know, not just General Westmoreland, but, a whole raft of people of various levels who really were myopic. And really it's because they didn't really want to know, in a way. I mean, that the pressure for people, for example, on the ground to keep presenting positive news to the people at the next level, and for them to, there was kind of a institutional lying that went on. So, there was a lack of realism through the entire period.
In the intro, I read the LBJ quote, "We are not about to send American boys 9 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asians ought to be doing for themselves."
Well, that turned out not to be true either. One of the things, so I was working on the Nixon period of the war. And over and over again, when I teach about Vietnam, I have students who say they don't understand it. Like, why didn't Richard Nixon get out of the war? He could blame Lyndon Johnson, whose presidency had been wrecked, just say this was a big series of mistakes, and he's going to, change the direction of the U.S. And, so that was actually one of the questions that my students repeatedly asked over many years, and was one of the motivators for this book. And there really is an answer to that, which is that it wasn't a matter of Nixon and Kissinger per se. It was through the entire governmental bureaucracies. There was lying and self-deception. And for example, I think this is very important. Right at the beginning of that administration, Henry Kissinger asked a very talented, relatively young man to do a questionnaire for the bureaucracies. And as it turns out, that young man was Daniel Ellsberg, who Kissinger had known at Harvard. But in any case, Kissinger wanted to get the opinion of people in the bureaucracies for a variety of reasons, including figuring out people who could be enemies, etc. But when you look at that, so we're talking about the earliest months of the Nixon administration. In particular, the military is really saying, we can win. That Tet Offensive, regardless of how it was being reported in the media, that in fact the enemy had sustained a significant damage, which actually was true. And that there was very good reason to persevere because you could actually change the situation. So in a certain sense, for Kissinger and Nixon both, to have changed the policy at that point would have been to run up against the received wisdom of the bureaucracies, and particularly the military. And that neither of those men were interested in doing that. Neither of them were that unorthodox that they were just going to defy the received wisdom.
Before we get into the book itself, tell me, when did you start? I know I saw an interview you had done with Mel Laird back in 2002, but when did you start putting this book together as a book?
It's hard to remember. I mean, I think initially I got interested in the project very much because of my students who are repetitively saying about a whole variety of things. We don't understand this. No, this reading isn't right. How could this be? So that was always in the background. I think I initially started this project when I was asked to do an essay for an anthology that Marilyn Young and Bob Bazanko were putting out on Vietnam, and they asked me to work on Nixon. And at that point, there wasn't, things were still very classified, were not so quickly available. So when I wrote the essay for that reader, I was really relying on, things that were published to a large extent, whether it was memoirs or other historians or articles, whatever. But at the end of doing that and having that article be published, I still didn't think it was right. I felt like in the end that I hadn't answered a lot of things that I was curious about. So I sort of dipped into it, like, I don't even remember, like 2004, 2005. So I can't even remember at what point I was really committed to doing a book. But one of the things that was interesting in this whole process was the declassification. There was availability of materials that I had never anticipated seeing. So that included, on the one hand, Henry Kissinger, when he left the White House finally, he had transcripts of all of his telephone calls. And, the guy seemed to have been on the telephone like absolutely all the time, a vast number. And he claimed those telecons as his personal property. But what he did, it still beat Trump, didn't hide it in the bathroom. is that what he did was he claimed them as his personal property. He deposited those telecons in the Library of Congress with the stipulation that they would not be open for 50 years. And then he was being sued for that. I can't even remember if it was the National Security Archive that was suing him. But at some point, his lawyers obviously told him that he was going to lose. And so one of the things what was unexpected in somewhere between 2004 and 2012 was all those telecons became available. And truthfully, some of them he had actually, you could see that he had actually doctored a few, but the person's on the telephone all the time. So, that's an illustration of, material that's just started pouring out. The other thing that was huge that was becoming available were all the declassified transcripts of his negotiations or Nixon's negotiations with the Soviets and the Chinese. And when I started my project, I didn't actually expect that I would have access to that material, but in fact, I did. And this is probably more than your listeners want to know, but it actually is interesting, which is that after the Cold War ended, the Soviet Union, or then Russia, made available to our State Department records from that period. So that, for example, when their ambassador Dobrynin met with Henry Kissinger, this ambassador would write back to Moscow and say, I had this meeting with Henry Kissinger, and this is what he said, and this is what I think, and so forth. So that was kind of a rarity, and it was interesting there because when Kissinger was writing to Nixon about what happened, and when Dobrynin was writing back to his superiors in Russia, their account of those meetings was actually pretty different. So it was challenging. So I don't know at what point I became fully committed to this project. And the project really changed over time. I think that's the other thing I would say. That one of the things that became important to me, and I guess this was somewhere, 15 or 16 years ago, is that I really wanted to write a book in which the policy decisions of the people on top could be joined to a discussion of what happens to actual people when they make these decisions. So that really complicated things, considerably. But I was looking for ways to make real to readers what these choices meant. So even, something as small as, actually it wasn't small, but when Nixon announced that he's going into Cambodia, which then set off a huge, explosion on college campuses. And, you never read about Cambodia in that moment in history without, going to Kent State and seeing that photograph. But I was really interested in what happened in Cambodia on those days, right? Which, was something that kind of got lost in the Kent State shuffle. But I thought it was really important for readers of this book, not just to hear what was happening on American campuses, but to actually, even just for that first week while things are exploding here, what was going on in the villages of Cambodia. And so that whole aspect of the project made this very slow. Took a really long time. And but I was really struggling through the entire process to really bring that other reality, into focus, so that readers could appreciate not just, what Nixon said to Kissinger and vice versa, and, all the people they hated and so forth, which is, good gossip, but that people readers could appreciate what these decisions actually made, what was the effect on real people in real, who lived in other countries. So that was really an important, part of the project. And also then finding materials that could, illuminate that. And please interrupt me because I could, I wrote a 500-page book and then I go on about this.
Well, hold on. Just I wanted to ask you, though, I take it you went to Vietnam?
Yes.
When?
I went to Vietnam. I always forget what year it was. 2000. I think it was 2010, 2011. And that's very important. I mean, that was going there, and I had asked, the arrangements for that were very complicated because you don't just arrive in Vietnam and say, I want to talk to this person and that. Everything had to be arranged through the U.S. Vietnam Friendship Society, which is a quasi-official entity. But I asked to do interviews with, to go to certain places, and on the whole, they were pretty helpful. And one of the people I had asked to see was Madame Bin, who was in Paris while the negotiations were going on. She was representing the PRG there, and she was in Paris for years. And then after North Vietnam won the war, she came back. She was Minister of Education, and then became Vice President of Vietnam. And so I had asked, to speak with her. And I was, I just did it, but I didn't know that I was going to get that. But in fact, I did have that interview. I'd been in Vietnam for about 3 days at that point. And just talking with her was like really an extraordinary experience.
What did you learn from her?
Pardon?
What did you learn from her?
Well, first of all, I mean, this is a side point, but interesting. It's one of the things she said to me when I was there is, you're about to go traveling around. You're going to be amazed about how friendly people here are to Americans. So you'll see it everywhere, which turned out to be about 97% true. And she said, you're going to wonder why that's true. And she said, there's a number of reasons. First of all, Uncle Ho always told us that the American people were not responsible for this, that this was their government. We also were acutely aware that there was a peace movement and that there were millions of Americans who wanted this violence to stop. But the third thing she said was that the number of U.S. veterans who had come back to Vietnam to do humanitarian service was truly remarkable. And when I was interviewing her, she had a very, very nice office that they gave her in Hanoi. And I think she was about 80 at that point. But she looked up and she said, I've met a number of veterans, U.S. veterans, who have come to our country to be helpful. And she sort of waved her arms and she said, if these walls could talk, the stories that I heard from Americans were just extraordinary. And she said, so there were Americans here. There have always been, veterans coming back, not to do, tourist things, but really to be helpful. And some of them have actually gone back to areas, especially in the northern part of South Vietnam, where a lot of Americans were, a lot of destruction was there. So a lot of them have gone back to those areas, to clear out unexploded ordnance and so forth. So that was really interesting. I didn't really know that until when I was traveling around Vietnam, I began to learn about that. But then later, I learned about it in other ways. So that was just kind of an interesting thing. But the other thing that she said that made sense was, I asked her, I said, look, you were here for years, for several years, and you knew that the real negotiations were happening with Henry Kissinger and Lê Duc Thao. And I can't remember what euphemism I used, but wasn't it boring to be sitting in Paris while the real discussions are going on some other place? And one of the things that she said was, well, part of her job was to relate to the anti-war movement and the anti-imperialist movement, the global movement that was there, she was there to meet with folks from those movements and talk with them. And she said, we had people from many different countries that came to meet with us and talk about what was happening and their feelings, and also, Americans in the anti-war movement. So at one point, I think I asked her, well, so in a certain way, when Richard Nixon said to the peace movement, you're working for the enemy, that was not like 110% wrong. And she sort of laughed and nodded. But I actually thought that was interesting because I can remember, during the war, various people from the peace movement would go to Paris and they say, oh, we talked to Madame Bin and this is what she suggested to us. But I think in a way, apart from interviews that I did, and there were a number of particular things that I learned, including that conversation. was actually seeing the place. I think in a way that was the most valuable, was really that, battles or incidents that, or, I was writing about in my book, that to be able to visualize it, or even to understand the distances between things, or, to realize that that just going across, the area of South Vietnam was a very narrow, place. I sort of thought of it as big. So, I mean, that was very helpful, I think, and just as a kind of reality check, apart from, just things that different people told me.
How much of an anti-war activist were you back in those days?
Well, I was always an anti-war activist. I can remember being an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, and this is going back to like 1963, and somebody from the American Friends Service Committee coming to our campus and giving a talk and telling us about strategic hamlets that the Americans were, forcing people into. And I can still remember that talk. It was like during freshman orientation, and she was telling us this, and people were like not believing her. And, then at our university, like many, the anti-war movement grew. So I was involved in that. And then when I was at Columbia in 1968, and, anti-war activity, as you probably know, was very important on the campus. And then when I finished graduate school as a professor at Dartmouth, when the Spring Offensive happened, and the United States was bombing Hanoi and Haiphong, and there was a faculty organization there. So I don't feel like I was one of the leaders of this movement, but I was always a part of it. However, I guess a point I wanted to make is that I didn't write this book to defend, our policies, 40 years ago. I did write this book to try to understand what had happened, and to try to understand the piece of it, of not just what the U.S. did in Vietnam, but Laos and Cambodia, and how those things fit together. I did get interested. This was not a primary thing at first. I did get interested on what were the things that the anti-war movement did that were effective, that actually shaped policy, and what were the things that the anti-war movement did that were not effective and did not produce any significant results. So I didn't really even start with that question, but then when I'm reading all these high policy statements, documents, I began to see that you could tell from those documents like what was impactful in the White House and what was not.
When
Yeah.
did the first public official from your study start telling us either lies or non-truths about Vietnam?
Well, I think it was true probably even in the Kennedy years, but that was obviously a truncated period. I mean, it's what the Pentagon Papers said. There was a lot of deception, yeah, of the American public. I mean, all through, there was a lot of deception, even including things which get easily forgotten, which is, the presentation of the South Vietnamese government as, this great democratic entity, right? And which was really the line on this, when Diem was in charge and when Lyndon Johnson was in charge, they were always presenting the government of South Vietnam as really representing, they are a democratic force, and they are being, imposed upon the people of Vietnam, and the Russians are responsible for that, and the Chinese are responsible for that. So I mean, that was an initial thing, and then a misrepresentation of what was happening on the battlefield, etc. But what I want to emphasize, and this is something I really learned to appreciate when I was reading all these documents, is that what kind of gets blurred at a certain point is at what point are the people who are, at the highest level of the Nixon administration, are they lying to the American people, and to what extent are they presiding over institutions in which lying is endemic, right? Because you have a whole psychology, like in the military, if you think about, Creighton and Westmoreland was gone by the Nixon period, and Creighton Abrams was in charge.
The general. General
Yeah,
Abrams, yeah.
right. But the White House didn't really want to hear bad news. And since, the White House didn't want to hear bad news, the Joint Chiefs of Staff didn't want to hear bad news. So there's pressure on the people below to misrepresent things, or, again, it's shades into self-deception. But people want to hear good news up the ladder. And so by the time you're getting to Nixon and Kissinger already, um, they don't even have access much at some of the time to really accurate information. There's one moment in my book, I don't know if I covered this properly, but in 1971 I realized that the situation in Laos was really pivotal for the administration. We didn't appreciate that at the time. I don't think most Americans did, but Laos was very important. And there was an operation called Lam Sum 719, which was going to be the first time where South Vietnamese troops on the ground were going to do a massive offensive, or I don't know if you call it an offensive, but they were going to go into Laos. They were going to block the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And the idea was there would be no U.S. ground troops. There would just be air power that would support them. And everything goes badly almost from the very beginning. The U.S. media was embargoed. They were told that for the initial thing, they weren't even allowed to cover it. They weren't allowed to print anything. They weren't even allowed to print that they weren't allowed to print. Literally, there's an embargo wouldn't be embargo. So you have a situation where the South Vietnamese troops are advancing, and the American air power is not all that effective. So Kissinger, at a certain point, as he starts to realize, and he's slow, that this isn't going well, he wants to understand why U.S. airplanes are not being sent on missions to the extent that he anticipated. So the question is, could he find out the weather? Because that was what it was related to, right? That he was being told by certain people that the reason there were not more bombing raids by the U.S. is because the weather is bad, but then other people say the weather is good. And so I always feel this is a moment of truth for Kissinger, where he realized he can't get people to tell him accurately what's the weather in this place. He literally can't do it, and he's frustrated with different individuals, but this is the whole process, right? It's not just like this is something that, happens one time. It's that the whole processing of information going up the line was so distorted.
What was the relationship between Henry Kissinger as the National Security Advisor to Richard Nixon and William Rogers, who was the Secretary of State, and Mel Laird, who was the Secretary of Defense?
Well, that's a very good question, and obviously I have quite a bit about that, in my book. The relationship between him and Rogers was terrible.
Why?
Why? Because Kissinger wanted to be in charge of everything. I mean, he felt like it was him and Nixon that were going to be the deciders. They were willing to have the State Department and Rogers deal with other things, but partly there's a power struggle that is taking place. And for Kissinger, the entire 40 years, he's always maneuvering to, cut Rogers out of the action and to cut other bureaucracies out of the action. I mean, one story, which I don't know if I ever found a way to tell it in an interesting manner, but that during this period, there were very important arms control talks that were going on in Helsinki. And the person in charge of that and the whole team was effectively under the control of the State Department. But in fact, Kissinger is so concerned he has a lot of concerns, but his main desire is to cut them out of the action. So the whole time that they're sitting, far away, working on the details of SALT, he's sitting in Washington talking to the Russian ambassador and making a different deal. And that just runs through the entire story. I mean, he just, in every possible way, he wanted to get control personally. And then, substantively, I think at various times, the State Department, I'm not just talking about Rogers, but the people under Rogers, at certain times, they actually didn't agree with things that the White House was doing. which would include, by the way, Cambodia. Right? I mean, the State Department was not enthusiastic about doing the secret bombing of Cambodia or the invasion of Cambodia. They didn't want to do these things. And you go right down the line, that when there was a choice about a more hawkish thing or less hawkish, more emphasis on diplomacy, the State Department was generally on the side of diplomacy. So there's a substantive part. Now,
what about the relationship between Kissinger and Laird?
Well, that is a really interesting question. And for me, it was one of the discoveries of this whole process, of looking at all these declassified documents, because, at the time that all these things were happening in real time, Melvin Laird, who was Secretary of Defense, was always perceived by folks in the peace movement as just another hawk. Not anybody, and maybe not even so powerful, but as somebody who's really wanting to take the most drastic action possible.
Let me interrupt just to say he was a 16-year member of the House of Representatives from Wisconsin, a Republican. Go ahead.
Right, and he actually, that's not little, because, that turns out to be an important fact about Mel Laird, because he was given that job by Nixon because of his experience in Congress. That, Nixon knew that he needed a Secretary of Defense that could go up to Capitol Hill and have the relationships and the knowledge about how things work, so that when he, whatever would come up, notably the budget for defense, that he wanted somebody who could, carry that task out. And Mel Laird, who was well liked and experienced on Capitol Hill, was somebody who could do that. But just to cut to the chase, what turned out to be true about Melvin Laird, once I started reading, is he was basically trying to get out of Vietnam. He was not such a hawk. This is before I talked with him a couple times, but just reading the record, he's very focused on one thing, and that is getting the troops out.
Did anybody know that at the time?
Well, not in the peace movement, you didn't, but yes, Kissinger and Nixon knew that. And again, they were a little bit different, because whatever Laird was saying about a specific situation, and however annoying that might be to Kissinger, Nixon understood that he needed Mel Laird. That, in fact, Mel Laird was much more important to him than Secretary of State Rogers, because, again, he needed Laird to go to Capitol Hill. And Laird would go on Capitol Hill and defend policies that he personally didn't agree with. But the trade-off was, and it was really true from, I would say, maybe 3 months into the administration, is that Laird had a trade-off. I always think of him as like Schindler, that, he would do what the president wanted him to do when he met congressional committees. And he would lie for the president. But he was extracting a price from the White House, and that was the removal of troops, which is something, as a person in the peace movement, every time Nixon went on television and said he was taking out more troops, everyone I knew just said, "Oh, it's a fraud, it's cheat, no, they're really expanding the war, they're deceiving us, it's PR." It wasn't. They were taking out troops. And by the time, something that I certainly at the time failed to appreciate, and everybody else, was that by 1972, when Nixon is up for re-election, there are no combat troops left in Vietnam, or if there are, there's a handful. There's only like maybe 20,000 that are still there, who are people who are functioning in an advisory capacity. And, so we didn't really appreciate that, but Mel Laird did. And right through the whole 4 years, they'd be discussing one thing or another, and then Laird would say, "Oh, by the way, Mr. President, weren't we going to take 40,000 troops out? I think we said that by February that was going to happen." And so he was relentless. And it's my personal opinion. I don't think I documented this necessarily, but I have a feeling, particularly for Laird, that the anti-war movement in Wisconsin was very important for him. Including, his son was in the anti-war movement, although, as you probably know, many people's sons were in the anti-war movement. So I don't think it's that. But the University of Wisconsin was exploding the whole time. And then there were the electoral considerations. And that's what Nixon valued about Laird is that Laird had his finger more on the political realities in the country, but also in Congress. And, one of the other things that I learned that was really interesting was, back then, there were many resolutions, many anti-war resolutions that were introduced, and they always lost until, the war was over, virtually. And so if you were outside that, you're in the anti-war movement, you say, oh, the Congress is terrible, it's a waste of time. But what I realized, as I was reading the record, is that it wasn't just a matter of votes. It was also a matter of informal relationships, so that there are important legislators who don't necessarily vote in a anti-war way, but they're meeting with Nixon, or they're meeting mostly with Nixon, but even with Kissinger. So you've got these legislators who are telling the president, you have to get out, regardless of what they're voting on or not voting on.
Let me interrupt, because you have this in your book that might be instructive. You talk about Lieutenant Charles Saxby, whose father was William Saxby, who was a senator from Ohio, became Attorney General. But here's a quote from his son, who was at Camp Lejeune. I'm going to have to risk my life in Southeast Asia within the next year. He's telling this to his dad. Risking my life in a war that hasn't been declared, can't be fought, can't be won, a war that is contrary to everything I've been taught to believe about America. Do you ever remember where that came from?
I don't remember. I think probably, I actually don't remember. I mean, there were so many declassified files, that I went through that it's actually hard to pinpoint where that is. But I knew, or maybe it's even possible that it was in the congressional record.
How much of this kind of thing did you find where sons of people in power were? I mean, I remember one particular senator whose son took out an ad in a newspaper opposed to his father in the war.
Do you remember who that was? I'm curious.
Somebody from Colorado? Don't remember?
I think it's very, I don't necessarily, I mean, actually the Kennedy administration, and Johnson administration was, more extreme case of that, where you had, Craig McNamara, who was very anti-war. Dean Rusk's son was very anti-war. The Bundy sons were very anti-war. I think it probably, with more intellectual types in the Johnson years, there's more sons that are making trouble. But I think even Agnew's daughter was, became involved in the peace movement at some point. So there is a generation.
Let's go, though, to your whole issue about the difference between people in power and the people weren't in power and what they were seeing, say, in Vietnam, or their families were seeing in Vietnam. And you say there was never a connection there. I mean, I think you made one comment about Nixon and Kissinger never went to the Chu Chi tunnels that you saw in Vietnam. They have no idea what it was like.
Well, right. I mean, that was in a way one of the things that was most startling when I went to Vietnam was the physical place. Like, you look at the Cu Chi tunnels, which are vast, and there's levels of the Cu Chi tunnels, and people are living there for months on end. And that was also true, not just there, but there were also tunnels in Quang Tri province that were very substantial as well. So it was in some sense, and then going to the Mekong Delta was very interesting in the same way, because you look at these things in sort of their physical embodiment, and you realize how difficult this situation really is. Like, what, you're really going to pacify the Mekong Delta? I had imagined it, from television, gray, whatever. But when you see it, it's different. The question you're asking is really important. As I indicated earlier, one of my important goals for this, which came a lot of ways out of my teaching, was doing not just policy, but then looking for ways to communicate the impact, and therefore trying to find out more about what was going on the ground in these various places. And I could talk later about the sources that I used for that. But So I was really doing that initially because as a teacher, I had realized over the years that students are not all that interested, or most students are not that interested in policy when it's disconnected from everything else. And Vietnam literature is very split. Like there's people writing personal things or, collectively personal things, and then policy and those things are separate. So that was a big goal for me, was to connect them, and I thought it'd be more interesting. But what I really ended up learning, going through this, is how little the situation on the ground, it had so little reality for the people who are making policy, that they're not interested when there are news journalists who are on the ground in Laos or Cambodia who are wanting to, tell what they're seeing. Nixon and Kissinger and the rest of them, they just regard it as intrusive. Like, why are they writing this, these stories? They hate Anthony Lewis because Anthony Lewis occasionally goes places and sees things and reports on what he sees.
Anthony Lewis, New York Times reporter.
Right. And they think of him as like this horrible individual. But what I began to understand in a sort of at a different level was their unwillingness to learn what was happening on the ground was part of why they made bad decisions. And when I'm saying bad, not just in a moral sense, but bad, in that they were unwise decisions. And that was repeatedly the case because they couldn't learn. And it's not just this is not just a book about two men, actually. I never figured out a good title because it's really about a lot of people. I mean, how these institutions really operate was that the reluctance to find out things really compromised, how they thought about things. There's one. So I didn't do a million interviews, but I did do some. I was really interested in talking to journalists, particularly who were there. But they consider these journalists just subversive and mean and malicious. And there's, one of the things I have in the book, it's just incredible to me, is I have a section in the book that's about Hamburger Hill, which is like, pretty famous. There was a movie about it, which I deliberately did not watch because I wanted to learn it myself. And so, this is this battle which made absolutely no sense. The North Vietnamese are on top of a hill, and this lieutenant keeps ordering his men up the hill like 9 times, and more of them get killed. It's totally pointless. And so what happens is 2 of the soldiers that are on Hamburger Hill and survived are interviewed, I think, on CBS. And they describe what they had been through, and their friends were killed. So these 2 soldiers, as they're describing what happened to their friends, start crying on CBS. And so what is the reaction of the White House? You might find it interesting or morally relevant, or just even knowing the morale of our troops. Nixon's response is, how come the Army let these people go on television? Right? I mean, that's what it. Why did they go on television? That was a mistake. And of course, that whole attitude again. I mean, one of the things that that lack of interest, which is almost, really is at an institutional level. It's not just these 2 people and, what they think, but, it just runs through this entire story. And so what they don't know, for example, I mean, they know a little of it, but not really, is what's happening to our troops. Right? I mean, that's another thing they didn't want to know about.
Let me go to your teaching.
Yes.
How long have you been at Hofstra?
I was at Hofstra I can't even tell, maybe 29 years.
Explain what the university's like and where it is.
It's on Long Island. It is a pretty vibrant place. It has, a strong undergraduate population, and then it also has, law school and now medical school and engineering school. So it's actually a very dynamic place, in a lot of respects. And the students there are really a mix. I mean, now there's like all these crazy stories about, how hard it is to get into Yale, like 1%. Uh, and Hofstra is not particularly selective in terms of the student body, which I actually think is a strength. And then there's a wide range of students. Some of them very academically skilled, others not. Our job is to make everybody skilled, right?
Talk about teaching the Vietnam War to students. How much do they know when they walk in your classroom, and what, and you say this book was written for their benefit. What are they going to learn specifically after that semester is over?
Well, I can't, of course, we never know what they learn, what happens after the semester is over. I mean, one thing that's really important that is a big change is when I first came to the university and taught about Vietnam, I had, numbers of students in the class who were in the class because their fathers were veterans. And so, it was not unusual when we went around and people introduced themselves. Students would say, I've taken this course, my father won't talk to me, right? I mean, that was really very common. And, students would say, well, I feel like if I'm studying this and, maybe my father will find this interesting, or, and as we go through the semester, sometimes students would say, well, my dad just read the book that we just did, or something like that. So that was very specific, really, in terms of that, for a number of years, the presence of students like that, was really valuable in the class because they brought a kind of intellectual energy to the process. I think I can't really, really authoritatively say what they took away. I had, but when I said it in the book, I mean, part of the way that students impacted, my writing was just the questions they kept asking, right? I mean, so and because the questions were good questions, right? And I didn't have answers for those, starting with question one, which is why does Nixon and Kissinger go on for 40 years with this thing that's a flop, really? But, bottom line, it's a flop. That's a student question. Another question that students had, and they were, there's always answers, but some answers are really not that persuasive. Was the students are interested in why are you having this war in Southeast Asia, and meanwhile you're making deals with the Soviet Union and China? Like, what in the world is that about? How to explain? And so again, it's not, we had readings in class, but a lot of students were dissatisfied with that. In terms of the takeaway, I think maybe the biggest takeaway is for students to understand that policy decisions have real life consequences. And that when they're reading a newspaper, which back then I have to say they did, now it's terrible. I mean, I think the situation is just terrible. I mean, my students are just not reading the news, or they're getting it from TikTok, or Twitter or whatever. So this is very different. It's a very different time. But I would say, like, my goal was always as a teacher, I didn't want to persuade students of anything, really. I wanted them to get the habit of thinking for themselves and being knowledgeable and knowing that policy is not an abstraction, that policy really matters for people. I think that would be what I care about.
On page 476, you make this definitive statement. America's Vietnam War was a failure. How often have you run into people that take you on and say, you don't get it? We were not a failure. And I know you mentioned Westmoreland earlier.
Right. So Westmoreland, I would say my interaction with Westmoreland was not a useful conversation for either of us. I don't really run into it very often. Again, maybe who I'm teaching. But we did one of the things we did on our campus for various reasons, like, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 years ago, was we had a whole series of events on Vietnam. And we included as part of that event veterans speak out. We were going to have like a speak out. And I, in trying to build that event, did not want to just have it be an event with, there are plenty of anti-war vets who are, or, who are still even now in an organization. So we reached out to them, but I very particularly didn't want us to be just one side. So I, also reached out to various veterans programs on Long Island, people whose views I had no idea about. And, tried to get, a wide variety of veterans that would come to campus and talk about their experiences. But so I didn't handpick people to be critics. But I would say, pretty overwhelmingly that that these veterans, maybe they didn't even necessarily have a view about how it came out. That was not exactly what they wanted to talk about. They more wanted to talk about their immediate experience. And for some of them, the immediate experience is that they're mad at anti-war people. This thing about people spitting at them is like ridiculous, but there's a deeper point, which is that people who felt, criticized and undermined by domestic dissent. That was real. But mostly what these folks wanted to just talk about was like their experience, what happened to them personally and what that was like. And weren't very interested in having like a big discussion about ultimate outcome.
What was your reaction when your alma mater just gave you the Bancroft Award? And what is that? I know it's a $10,000 award. Mean anything to you?
That I got the award, or the fact that there are police arresting students on campus?
Either one.
Either one. Happy to get the award, a little incredulous. Back in 1968, one of the concerns that students had was that the university was expanding into Harlem and therefore, taking housing away from the community. So I received my prize, in what used to be Harlem, right? Because the university is moved in a very massive way. It was a lovely prize, and it was, all the people involved in it were just incredibly gracious and kind. So me personally, it was really a good experience. The fact that they were arresting people down, nine blocks away, I thought it was terrible. I saw the accounts of the Columbia president's remarks on Capitol Hill. I guess 2 days ago, which I feel as though she started out, strong with some recognition of the complexities. And then she started under the pressure of that questioning. She, became more and more, telling them what they wanted to hear. I think the arrests, and the students probably organized this event to coincide with that, appearance by the president. And she, and I'm sure some of her response to their protest was because she had just promised all these people on Capitol Hill that there would be a crackdown. One of my thoughts is how stupid this was, because like what happened at the university in 68 and can happen now is you get cops on campus and they're arresting people. And, then more of the campus gets alienated by the presence of police. So that's certainly what happened at Columbia in 68 was, they arrested about 1,000 people. I was actually one of them. And then, partly the one thing that happened in 68 that I don't think happened here was the police riot. Because, something that's not understood about 68 was like if you were in a building, except where students were resisting arrest, but if you were in one of those 5 buildings, the police were pretty okay. My husband and I were in the building, and police were, we had a very nice arresting officer. It was, there was nothing unpleasant. But what happened was the cops, not so much the cops in the building, except at Lowe, were rioting on the campus. They were beating up kids who were not in the buildings, which was really ridiculous. So that, of course, set the whole campus off.
What happened to you when you were arrested?
What happened was, this is contrary to the stereotypes. My husband and I were both arrested in a space in Fairweather where there were hundreds of us in Fairweather, and we were all people not resisting arrest, and we knew that we were going to be arrested. We actually had a lovely police officer. I'm not kidding. I mean, he was so nice that at some point, because there was a women's jail and a jail for men, women's jail was very crowded because they arrested, I think, like 400 women. But at some point, that arresting officer was in the prison and told me that he knew had been some violence involved, and he wanted me to know that my husband was fine. So I thought that was very nice. I mean, so I actually think the experiences were very varied, but a lot of the police were very rough. And one in Low Library, they were very, very brutal with kids. And
Low's the name of the library. Low.
Low is actually not the library. It's called Low Library, but that's where the administration was.
The big building there in the quad. Right. Go back to what you said earlier, that there were lessons learned, that, in your opinion, good and bad, about what activism, what works and what doesn't work. Could you go back to that and tell us what you think works and doesn't work?
Well, it's probably less cut and dried than I'm saying, but I feel like I learned a lot from those declassified records in terms of what was having an impact. And I do think that some of the very extreme behavior by demonstrators, this is not going to come as a revelation, but some of the more extreme behaviors that went on, were damaging, because it made other people in the society feel, here are these privileged students and they're, behaving in such an outrageous way. But even with the things that were violent and that actually annoyed people, it was a little bit of a mixed bag, even there, because it also contributed to a sense that our society is coming apart because of this war, and it would probably be a better idea not to have that going on. So I would say some of that militant activity is much more, that's double-edged. What I realized more was the importance of congressional opinion and of activity involved in pressuring members of Congress, that all that legislative work, that the electoral politics, that it was actually more effective than I appreciated at the time. And I think to a large extent, if you were in the anti-war movement back then, one of the things that was very pervasive was the feeling of, oh my God, these horrible things are happening. Americans are dying, Laotians are dying, and everything we're doing isn't working, right? It's just like a failure. And, if I could give you one extreme example of what felt like a failure, would be the McGovern campaign, right? That, in the anti-war movement, the more mainstream activity was to work for a peace candidate in the Democratic Party.
This is in 72.
This is 72. And so, there was all this work for George McGovern. And then you had an election in which he, it was a total flop. Right?
What did he win? One state?
Right. I think he won Massachusetts. Right. So the conventional wisdom, in the anti-war world is, well, this is an example of how stupid electoral politics is. But what I start to really understand reading the record is that McGovern was a lot more successful than we understood, because he changed the Democratic Party, for one thing, right? The people that were candidates who were rivals to him, like Hubert Humphrey and Muskie and people like that, who, had not been very strong about the war, that the entire party moved into an anti-war posture as a consequence of the McGovern candidacy is very, very significant. And it also, so in any event, that was one thing. Another thing that happened as a result of the electoral activity that I think nobody I knew paid any attention to is that in that election of 72, there were some more anti-war senators who were elected. So what does that all mean? Well, one of the things that meant is that I would say a week after Election Day, some of the most conservative senators, I want to say Tower and Stennis and maybe Gerald Ford, they go up to Capitol Hill and they say to Nixon, we don't have the votes. Understand that when we come back, when the new Congress comes in January, there will be no money for Vietnam. At this point, Kissinger is, in Paris diddling around. So you need to make it clear that we have to have a peace agreement because there will be a cutoff of the war. So that was certainly something I didn't know anything about. I think I didn't give a thought, or nobody I knew, to the fact that maybe two more anti-war senators were, had been elected. It seemed like the least significant thing. And the other piece that we missed, and again, I think this is very related to electoral work and to Congress, even Congress that doesn't ever really pass a good resolution, is the removal of troops. Because partly and this is where Laird is kind of a linchpin. I mean, essentially what Laird is saying to Nixon is you've got to bring the troops out. You've got to start doing that. Or you're politically, you're going to end up like Lyndon Johnson. And so, there was a poll taken right at the time that, that election with McGovern. Americans were asked, who do you trust to end the war more, Richard Nixon or George McGovern? And people said overwhelmingly Richard Nixon. And I remember, if you were in the anti-war movement, you were saying, oh my God, the American people are so stupid. Like, how are they tricked like this? But actually, we were tricked. Because what Americans were seeing across the country was troops were coming home. Nixon brought them home, which is what Melvin Laird told him to do, right? So, whatever rhetoric is getting shared in the actual campaign, and again, the McGovern candidacy was a pressure in that direction. You're living in a little town in Ohio, and there's 5 kids that have been in the military, and they come home. And that's a very important thing. And you don't care about anything else.
As you know, in the book, I mean, at the top during the Lyndon Johnson administration, 550,000 American troops. And then at 20,000 at the time that Richard Nixon was elected, or right after, I guess by 72.
Right.
What do you think? Well, let me ask you two things and then we'll wrap it up. One, what is your personal analysis, not necessarily about the war, but of both Kissinger and Nixon? What do you think of them?
I think they were very intelligent. I think they were emotionally very damaged people. Obviously people who, for whom power was the important thing. The lack of sensitivity or interest, again, in just like finding out anything about people. I mean, it's just extraordinary. But, one of the problems that I really had writing this book, and I don't think I settled it at all, is so they are the deciders. In the end, they are the deciders, and that's why they have to be centered in the book. But it's not just them. And that's really an important point in the book. I mean, when, going back to the very beginning, when they first come into office, you want to recognize that as smart as they were, whatever, they're also conformists. Nixon didn't get where he was by challenging any orthodox thing. And neither really did Henry Kissinger. These are people who know how to, get along with other people in power and so forth. So when they come in and they're being told by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, for example, oh, well, if we only do X and Y, this could be a victory. They're not that critical of that. They're lacking in a certain kind of critical sensibility, as smart as they are, because they are taking, what is conventional wisdom in the bureaucracies and basically acting that way. Now, they change over time. I mean, so that's a whole other longer story. And part of why they change is that they're mad at the bureaucracies because they're getting stuck holding the bag. They take their advice of the military, and then, something goes wrong. And so over time, I mean, they go from thinking that, General Creighton Abrams is the most brilliant person in the world to really deciding he's an absolute fool. So that's over time. And so they become themselves more skeptical about things that they're being advised to do. So there is that change.
Go ahead, finish your comment.
But no, I mean, they're hostile guys. There's ways that two of them, this is like terrible psychologizing, but I had this discussion with Stanley Cutler at one point, who got the tapes released.
The writer, Stanley Cutler,
right. So, sometimes you read the conversations they have, and they're like two boys in junior high school who are like, don't like all the other kids, and, are like, have a sort of crazy combination of grandiosity and weakness. So, I mean, there's a lot you could say about their personalities, but it's not about personalities, really. It isn't. It's not because they're stupid, because they aren't. It's about how our institutions work and the conventional wisdom. And that's really what this story is.
Last question. What is, in your opinion, the impact of the Vietnam War on the country since then?
And the country since then? It's a really good question. I think there's sort of cliche things you could say about it, in terms of that there was, I think, a national reaction against military adventures, right? That it was going to be less easy for an American president to commit U.S. troops to, a difficult situation. So I think you had that. But, honestly, I feel right now, this is probably colored by, I think, the Biden administration's terrible mishandling of what's happened in Gaza. I don't know that there's like durable lessons. I mean, durable lessons was to the Pentagon to control journalists, for example, right? They said, in Desert Storm, and then the invasion of Iraq, and they put much more restrictions on journalists, so journalists couldn't go. Also wherever possible, it's better to bomb places than to send troops there. There are all those kind of lessons, but have we, as a country, become more sensitive, more interested in what U.S. policy is doing? Are people now watching the U.S. government arm Israel while they're slaughtering civilians? And is our country more alert and sensitive to that situation? I don't think so. It's horrifying. So in that sense, it's sort of reminiscent of the early days of Vietnam. Who cared about Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, our own troops? It'd be nice to say there were all these lessons learned, but I don't know that the important ones were really learned.
The name of the book is Fire and Rain, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Wars in Southeast Asia. Our guest is Hofstra University professor Carolyn Woods Eisenberg. We thank you for your time.
And thank you for your wonderful interview. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.